Hey class, I'm going to talk about chapter 6 now. Please excuse my horrible voice. I'm a little sick this week. It's better today than it was yesterday, so I'm going to try to get this video out now. So, this chapter, we're talking about employee rights, and there's a few different kinds of rights that we talk about in this chapter. And first off, you're going to have legal rights, and those are, you have the legal right for your employee not to sexually harass you. That's bound in law. There's contractual rights, which means that when you enter into employment with an employer, you're going to be signing some sort of contract, job offer, etc. And those will outline kind of what benefits you get with the job. And so those are your rights by the contract that you signed and entered into when you started working. They're not necessarily legal because they're not bound by law, but they are bound by the contract of your working with the people. So the last one that we're going to focus a little more on in this chapter are human rights, or what are some basic moral rights that we have as employees, and what do employers owe us? And so there's a few that we'll go into, starting with the right to work. And the right to work is taken a few different ways. So the first way you could describe the right to work is the right to work without joining a union. And they explain this pretty well in the chapter, but basically, a lot of unions require that everybody that work for a certain company be a part of the union and pay union dues, because everybody who works at that place of employment gets the benefits from the union advocating for them. And so some states have a right to work law that says that you don't have to be part of that union. It makes it illegal to be a requirement to join the union to work. So it has its pros and cons because, like the book discusses, once you are working at a place that has a union, you get the benefits from that union. So typically, if you're getting the benefits from using something, you should pay to be part of that something to get those benefits and share the cost. And as this is especially important because unions have traditionally been really advocated against, because especially by businesses and those in power, because unions kind of level the playing field a little bit more between employees and employers. Employees are able to negotiate better when they're part of a collective versus just as an individual person arguing against an employer. So there's that right to work. Another definition of right to work might mean a right to having a job. Like we all have a right to have a job. And that's a great right in theory, but who provides that? Who is expected to give everybody a job? And we can't expect just private employers to be required um, to provide that to people, because if they can't afford to have those employees, we can't make them hire those employees. And so, sorry, it's just my nose is really crappy, but we can't make private employers hire people. And we can't just make the government hire everybody either. That doesn't really work, because then they'd have to offer a job to everybody. And if the people aren't qualified or they can't do the jobs, then it doesn't make sense for that to happen. And it wouldn't be very efficient anyway. So, kind of a in the middle idea for a right to a job is that the government assists people in getting jobs in the private sector and incentivizes the private sector to offer jobs. And then they also offer jobs to people who maybe can't find it. And that's kind of an in the middle look at the right to work. And then finally, the final look at a right to work or definition might mean that you have the right to have a job with some security. Like you can't, like you have a right to work, as in you have a right to go to work and expect there to be work for you each day and to not get just fired for no reason. And that's what we kind of get into next, is a couple different looks at that theory. So it's kind of called employment at will. And that is what many states have um, as a standard. And employment at will means that you as an employee have a right to work or a right to quit anytime you want. You are not bound to your job in any legal way. So you're free to quit, but it also means that your employer is free to fire you for any reason at all. Even if there's not cause, even if they just have a bad day, whatever. They're allowed to fire you whenever. And so there's some issues with this, obviously, because it can be hard as an employee to just obviously get fired for almost no reason or even a really bad reason. And so there's been some more laws and some more legislation about employment at will. And now it instead of just putting the onus on the employee to prove that they were unjustly fired or to have to show people that they were fired wrongly to win a lawsuit. There's a little bit more power shifting towards the employee, meaning that the employer has to prove that they fired the employee for good reason. And that's what's called due process, which is the next section. So due process means that the employer has to dismiss for a cause and they have to document that cause. So a lot of times that looks like getting a warning for something and then getting written up and then having a meeting about it, etc. So every company or business should have might have a kind of a different process for what this looks like. But as a business owner, especially if you are one or if you're going to ever have employees or manage employees, it is so important to um, document everything that the employee does, because then you have a case for why the employee was fired versus them being able to sue you because they feel like they were unjustly fired. So make sure you document your case, document any write-ups or verbal warnings, etc. And yeah, so the due process is, I think, a better way to go about it. Like that way you're not just getting fired for no reason. You actually have a chance to fix something if you're doing something wrong. So there's a couple arguments against due process, and those arguments are that if you have the freedom as an individual to quit whenever you want, then employers should have the freedom to fire you whenever they want. Another argument is that individuals have the freedom to contract with an employer and they get to decide the terms of that contract, and if they decide that it's okay for the employer to fire them whenever, then that's part of the contract. And the argument against both those things, the counter argument, I should say, we're getting into arguments and counter arguments, that employers aren't always as hurt as much as employees are by being fired. So there's more power in the employer's hands, right? If they fire somebody, that's that's going to negatively affect them, but you just killed the livelihood of somebody else, and that's obviously a worse negative effect. So if we take into consideration kind of a utilitarian standpoint, who's hurt more, what does the most good, and due process creates more good for everyone involved. It doesn't mean you can't still fire someone, you can, but you just have to have reasoning for it. Another argument against due process is something about property rights, but that'd be arguing that people are property and people are not property. So that's kind of a void argument. I don't know why he even brought it up in this section. And then the final argument against due process is that it argues that due process makes people lazy. Like if you can't just fire someone for being lazy or unproductive, then what reason do they have to not be lazy or unproductive? And that has its merits and its cons as well, because if you have due process, that means that you are not punishing but warning the employees about what they're doing, and once you go through the process of doing those warnings, if they continue being unproductive or lazy, then you can fire them and you have it documented, like, hey, this is the steps I took to try to correct the behavior, and they continue doing it anyway, so that's why I had to let them go. And it's documented and you have just cause. And that's fine, and you're allowed to do that. Instead of just like showing up to work one day and firing them, you've actually tried to fix the behavior and um, let them know what they were doing wrong. So this is interesting too, I think, when it comes to unions and how unions work and the things they negotiate for. So, like, especially you guys are all in academia and the academic world, there's tenured professors. And that means the union has bargained this system where these professors don't have to worry about getting fired as easily as they might be. But on the other hand, it makes it incredibly difficult to fire someone even for with cause. And so I know, like, we had a terrible, terrible professor, and I was on the side of trying to get them out of the school, and it was almost impossible, and it still ended up in a legal battle because of how much protection they have. So, just so you know, if you have a really bad professor that's tenured, it's almost impossible to get rid of them. That's why they're still there, even though they're terrible. So, like I said, pros and cons, it depends on how much you negotiate for, and I think it's important to protect jobs and have due process, but I think there should be a limit on that, and nobody should be exempt from being fired if they no longer deserve the position, I think. So, pros and cons, for sure. Okay, the next right that the book talks about is participation rights. And participation rights is talking about how much employees should get to participate in making decisions for the business. And I don't know many jobs that really incorporate this. I don't think I've worked for many positions that really take into account what all the underlings say or say should happen. Most of the time, it's leadership down decisions, and that's kind of what we're used to as employees. But there's some arguments that participation is important in a business because we should treat people not as a means to an end, but as an end of themselves. So by treating people with respect, that means including them in participation and getting authority from the consent of those you're governing, basically. So that means people should have a say in any big decision that's going to affect them in the workplace, and they have the right to be treated as partners in this in the decision making process because they are going to be part of that decision making. And arguments against that are that business owners might know better, or they have more stake involved with the business, with the property, and so they might have more at stake for these decisions. Employees might lack some expertise, so they might not quite understand the full extent of the consequences of the decision because they might not just have that full expertise of the whole picture of the business. They might know some parts of the business, but they might not have the big picture, and so it'd be harder for them to make a decision. And then the final argument against participation rights is that it might be inefficient. So if you have a decision and let's say you have a really big company, it might be really hard to get the opinion of everybody in that huge company. And also there might be a conflict of interest too with that because one decision could benefit the employees, but it could hurt the business maybe. Like let's give everybody a $5,000 raise or something. You can't do that as a business, even though employees would definitely vote for that. So there could be a conflict of interest there about what's best for the business versus what's best for employees. And it's good to find a middle ground there. But that's some arguments against participation rights. But I think in general, it's a good idea if you can to try to let employees participate. They might have a different thought process or a different point of view that you might not have even considered. So I think it's really good to listen to your employees when making some decisions that will affect them. Okay, the next right that they talk about is freedom of expression. So, I think this is a big one that's been argued about a lot lately. They have some good examples in there about different social media posts that have happened that have led to people being fired, or different, sorry, political activities that have led to people getting fired. And it's a good discussion on, do we have the right as businesses to fire someone because of something they post on social media or some political view that they express? And I think we know we have the right and we have freedom of expression as long as we're not hurting anybody else. But businesses also have the right to not employ people that don't have the same views or and that's both good and bad, right? So if you see it from a personal standpoint, like you want to be able to post what you want, maybe you should just keep some things private. You don't need to publicly post a lot of stuff. But you should be able to post what you want, and that's true. But as a business owner, if somebody I'm hiring has a attitude or a viewpoint that is completely counteractive to my beliefs and my business's standpoint and point of view, I don't think I should have to keep that person hired in my employee as my employee. Because if they are publicly going against what my business stands for, then how does that look on me as a business owner? It looks probably pretty bad. So, I think business owners have rights there, as well as people have rights. So, balancing those rights and making sure that nobody's rights are really violated, as long as you're protecting your business and have a good reason, I think, for um, having an issue with things being posted. So there's a fine line there. It's going to be continued to be debated, I'm sure, as we go into the future. Okay, so sorry about my nose, guys. I really am. Okay, moving on. We got a couple more. So the next right is to safety and health, and this one seems kind of obvious, and there's lots of laws about it now. But you have a right to a safe and healthy workplace. Like you shouldn't have to go to work and expose yourself to toxic chemicals or really dangerous working conditions unless that's inherently in your contract. Like, what is it? Underwater welding, I think, is one of the most dangerous professions that exists, but it still exists and people still do it and they make a lot of money because it's so dangerous. So it's kind of like you get paid for how much risk you're willing to take sometimes. But that's not always true either. Sometimes the jobs that are available are the only jobs that are available, and they might be inherently risky and dangerous. They mentioned like coal mining. Well, in some places, it's like you do the coal mining or you don't have a job, and so that's not really a choice per se. So you should have a right to a fairly safe work environment, and there's a lot to that. But basically, we have OSHA, OSHA, and it's an entity that kind of helps protect workers and judges when working conditions are not safe and are not fair to workers. And it's tough because it's a government entity and they are way overwhelmed. There are too many businesses out there and not enough OSHA employers to look at all of those businesses. And so a lot of workplaces get away with really unsafe working conditions. And so it really should be it's not your job, but as an employee, if you do notice really unsafe working condition, you should report it and try to get OSHA involved because they're not just going to swing by and notice it. You have to try to get them involved, and especially if it's really dangerous. And if it's too dangerous, you should really try to not be at that job, I guess. So determine your own level of risk and um, figure that out. So it's the ethics of safety and health in the workplace is kind of interesting because there's always going to be some risks, right? There's always going to be something dangerous about your job. Even an office job, you get paper cut or you could accidentally staple your finger. I've seen it happen. Um, so there's always going to be risk. There's always going to be ways you can hurt yourself or hurt others or something could go wrong anywhere you work. And so we have to kind of determine as employees or employees and employers what is an okay risk? What is an acceptable risk? And you can take this even further, and some people call for a cost benefit analysis. So, what would be the cost of preventing this dangerous thing from happening versus what are the benefits? Like, I could spend millions and millions of dollars like bubble wrapping everything in my office so that nobody could possibly fall and get injured, but what's the cost of that versus what's the actual benefit of that? And it gets even scarier when you're actually talking about dangerous workplace and professions like what is the cost of making this safer versus what is the cost of a human limb? What is the cost of a human life? And can you put a value on those things? People do. There are models that have those things written out. And that's kind of scary because how do you value that kind of stuff? How do you value a life? They do. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things to the ethics of safety and health for sure. Okay, and finally, we talk about privacy in the workplace. This is a big one nowadays, especially after COVID and people started working from home and finding out that they were being recorded at all times on the employees' laptops and computers. That's really creepy. Stuff like that. But basically, privacy is really vague. We don't have a great definition for what it means and what we are entitled to. But I do like the definition they have in here that privacy is violated when someone learns information about you that they shouldn't have, that they have no right to. So I like their example of like, yeah, my employer needs my social security numbers for filing taxes, but my classroom students don't need that information. Or credit score, I think was the example, but same thing. Like they don't need that personal information about me. So if somebody has information about you that they shouldn't have, that's usually what is considered a violation of privacy. And so this relates to employers because um, they might infringe. So privacy might be violated if they infringe upon personal decisions that are irrelevant in the context of their relationship with you. So the employment contract, you have a contract to work for the employer and for them to get your work. If they're infringing on anything personal that's not relevant to that contract of work, then that's a violation of privacy. Um, it's also a violation if they are collecting, using, or storing information about you without your consent. So I think the biggest part here for businesses, if you don't want to violate, sorry, privacy issues, if you don't want to violate your employees' privacy, is it's really important to have informed, voluntary, and consensual collection of data or collection of information. So employees have to know about it. They have to be aware. You have to tell them what data you're collecting. You have to tell them that you're filming them from their laptop camera. They have to be completely 100% aware of what you're doing. Secondly, they have to voluntarily agree to it. So they can't be coerced, they can't be made or forced into agreeing to it. They have to voluntarily offer that information. And it has to be consensual. So they have to agree and you have to agree. And as long as all parties agree to what is being collected and stored or used data wise, then you're good. But if not, you're probably violating someone's privacy. And so those are kind of the rights. Some of them have, laws and stuff around them. There's definitely been cases about all of those court cases and stuff like that. But none of there's always more. There's always further that you can get into that and more laws that could be put in place around those things, around those rights. But as an employee, you should be aware of those rights for yourself and hopefully not enter into a contract of employment with somebody who might violate those things to your definition and your standards. So, something important to think about. And that's all for chapter 6.